All right, good evening. I call this May 2nd Sammamish Planning Commission meeting to order here in Council Chambers in Sammamish City Hall. Tonight we have an interesting discussion about shoreline management, but let's start with roll call. So starting on my left.
Larry Crandall.
Roshino Farrell.
Mark Boffman.
Eric Brooks.
Rituja Indapure.
Mark Lewis.
Thank you. Josh Amato may join us on the phone. We'll see if that works or not. There were some technical difficulties, so we're watching to see if he can make that work. All right, next, approval of the agenda. Has everyone had a chance to review the agenda, and does anyone have any objections to the agenda or comments? Okay, then the agenda for this evening is approved. Next is the minutes from our last meeting, from the April 18th meeting. Would anyone like to make any corrections? Did anyone have any comments about that meeting, those meeting notes? Okay, seeing no objections, then the meeting notes are also approved from the last meeting. Next, we will have public comment for non-agenda items. So 3 minutes per person, 5 minutes if you're representing a group. Would anyone like to make comments this evening to the Planning Commission about a non-agenda item? So we're going to be talking about the shoreline management. So if it's anything other than shoreline management, now would be the time. I'm assuming that these three are all for the agenda item tonight. So anyone for non-agenda? Okay. No one for public comment on non-agenda items. Let's move on. New business, as I mentioned, we have Shoreline Master Program discussion this evening, and starting with a presentation from staff. Commissioner Amato did text me and said that he's available, so it's at an appropriate point where we have a break, we can try it.
I'm sorry, the person you are trying to reach has a voice.
Okay, let's move on. Yeah, let's go ahead and move on, and maybe later we'll try one more time, or if he texts me, we'll try again.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Tracy Tree, Senior Planner with Community Development. Today, I would like to give a brief presentation regarding the business item on the agenda today, Shoreline Master Program Periodic Review. So the topics will include a brief introduction of Shoreline Management Act and the Shoreline Master Program, and what are the Shoreline Master Program update process are, and also what's the requirements for the SMP periodic review process. And then lastly, I will touch a little bit the estimate timeline for this SMP update. So I will start off, what is a Shoreline Management Act? When was it passed? So the SMA was passed by the Washington legislature in 1971 and adopted by the voters in 1972. This SMA was adopted in a response to a piecemeal development within the shoreline states. There was a great concern throughout the state relating to their utilization, protection, restoration, and preservation. So the overarching goal of this act is to prevent the inherent harm in a piecemeal development within the shoreline states. So where does this SMA apply? So according to the SMA, the shorelines of the state are generally defined as rivers and streams with flow volumes of greater than 20 cubic feet per second, or lakes with a surface water of greater than 20 acres, plus the upland area extending 200 feet landward of these waters. So in the city of Sammamish, we have Lake Sammamish, Pine Lake, and Beaver Lake. These lakes constitute the city's state's shorelines. There's the three basic policies under the SMA. So the first one is the shoreline use, and the second one is environmental protection, and the third one is public access. I would like to touch a little bit on each item. The first one, shoreline use. So the SMA established the concept of the preferred shoreline uses. These uses are consistent with controlling pollution, preventing damage to the natural environment, and to dependent upon of the shoreline of the state. So for instance, the preferred use within the shoreline of the states are single-family residences, shoreline recreational uses, and other type of developments providing public access opportunities. And the second basic policy under the SMA is the environmental protection. The SMA is intended to protect shoreline natural resources, including the land, vegetation, wildlife, against adverse environmental impacts. So all the allowable uses with the shoreline states require to offset any type of negative impact to the shoreline environment. So more than often, you will see the shoreline projects will be required to do 15 feet wide, immediately waterward of the area to be native plantings. So the goal is to enhance the environmental function within that area. So the last one, the policy under the SMA is the public access. So the SMA also includes a public access, which providing a provision for public access to public-owned areas. These include elements for preserving and enlarging recreational opportunities. For example, seeing public access like public parks or trailing system. So under the Act, I would like to talk a little about the Shoreline Master Program. So Shoreline Master Program is required under the SMA. Under the Act, each city and county within shorelines of the state must complete a local planning process, which includes preparation and adoption of a locally appropriate shoreline master program. And this master program must be based on a local rules and state laws that is tailored to the specific geographic, economic, and environmental needs for the community. And one thing I want to point out is the local SMA must be adopted by the local jurisdiction and also be reviewed and approved by the Washington Department of Ecology. So when was the last city update the SMP? So starting in 2009, the city has been went through a very comprehensive process of SMP update, which was formally adopted by the City Council in 2011, and also being approved by the Department of Ecology also the same year in 2011. So I would also mention that process was very intense. We had a lot of meetings. We have hundreds of public comments through the whole process. So my next slide, I will talk about how to update the SMP, what process, what options we have in order to make any changes to our local SMP. So the first option is called locally initiated update. So this can initiate at any point as deemed necessary by the local government. A locally initiated update is a response to a city SMP that is anything changes in the local government regulations and also relation to any changes in our partner regulations that's being processed through the process. So for instance, if we updating another section of a code, which will ultimately trigger changes to SMP, then we can initiate that updates to the SMP. The examples we have is 2016 and 2017. We are doing the critical area ordinance updates. So these changes will trigger updates to our SMP. So the second process option is called periodic review. This is a state mandated periodic review, which is required at least to be done every 8 years. So since our last time we have a comprehensive update in 2011, so in 2019, the city is subject to this periodic review. That's why we're talking about this business item today. So what are the requirements to accomplish this update? The first of all is a checklist. So there's a checklist provided by the State Department of Ecology by cities conducting this periodic review of their SMP. And this checklist summarizes amendments to the state laws, rules, and applicable updated guidance adopted between 2007 and 2017. That may trigger the needs for the local SMP amendments. So besides this checklist, we also, the state also offered the city any desired changes want to address some local issues. So during this update, we identified 2 local issues. The first issue is regarding the recreational lot uses. The city has recently seen a lot of intense use of recreational lot for property, especially Zone R4, intended for primarily single-family use, but has been used as a recreational use shared by multiple owners in terms like public, private beach parks or private beach clubs. So in order to address this issue, we have done analysis and providing some more proposed changes to address this issue. And you can see this is the memo included in the agenda bill as exhibit number 4. So the second issue is regarding the fish-bearing stream definition. This issue was raised by a letter we received from Snoqualmie tribe. They identified there's some inconsistency between the definition of fish stream and the state law. So in order to address this inconsistency, we propose some changes, and this is in the exhibit number 5. Following that, I would like to talk about so what kind of legislative review process would be like to take to complete this SMP update. So the city has decided to use this optional joint review process. This process will allow us to consolidate the local and the state public comment periods. So we'll be holding a joint public hearing with state. And we are intensively to schedule this meeting on June 6, 2019. Lastly, I would like to talk about the estimate timeline for this SMP update. As you can see on today, the kickoff meeting with Planning Commission meeting as a work study session, we talk about this topic on the agenda bill. And following that, we're gonna have a joint state and city public hearing, which we'll schedule for June 6. And then the city, we anticipate, will transmit the draft SMP and all the responses to the public comments by the end of June. And we anticipate the ecology will have an initial determination by the end of July. And the city council we anticipate the city council will make adoption during September or October. And finally, we hope the ecology will approve this SMP by around October and November. Thank you. I would like to, so we have the city's consultant, Aaron Bowie from Environmental Science Associates. We bring him under contract to help us within this SMP update. I will pass to Aaron Bowie to present his PowerPoint.
Can I just briefly mention that none of these monitors from mine's working, and none of them that way are. So we're sharing here as best we can. So if there's some really small print, Larry's not going to have a chance.
I think they easily just kind of,
Yeah, or he can turn around, and everybody can see the back of his head.
yeah.
So just for the record, this is probably one of the most archaic systems we have in the building, and I can honestly say that there has not been a meeting I've been to here where there is some level of failure, and it is on the budget for replacement, complete replacement. So our apologies there. It's something that we struggle with in all the public meetings we hold in this room. So my apology.
It's a very strategic way to get the budget approved.
Evening, everyone. My name's Aaron Boy. As Tracy said, I'm with Environmental Science Associates, or ESA, environmental consulting company contracted by the city to support this update effort. Tracy and I coordinated to sort of together sort of start off with an introduction of shoreline management and the city's shoreline master program. And then my presentation is really focused on getting into a little bit more on the key focus of our effort as a consultant supporting the city, looking at the requirements of the periodic update from the Department of Ecology, those key periodic review findings, as well as the key findings of one of those two locally identified issues. And then the last thing that we were asked to do was support drafting of proposed amendments as are reflected in Exhibit 2 of your packet this evening, the red line changes to the current codified SMP. So just a little bit about Environmental Science Associates. We have a long relationship, and I've had the pleasure of working with the city of Sammamish for some time, dating back 13 years. I was a part of the team that supported the comprehensive SMP update back between, I think it started in 2008 or 9, probably 2008, and then eventually adopted in 2011. And I also support David and Tracy under an environmental on-call with the city, looking at development review for shoreline development proposals and also implementation of critical areas requirements. So it gives me a lot of perspective as to both the code side and then implementation, what development's looking like on the ground. So the sort of overview of what our support included for this periodic update process. We examined the current SMP for consistency with updated state guidelines. As you've seen in Exhibit 3 in your packet, the State Department of Ecology provided a periodic review checklist that provides sort of a template for ensuring that consistency. We considered that checklist along with Ecology's guidance and a detailed look at the code and provided recommendations for updates. The other main component of our support was the focused review looking at private lakeside recreational lots, which Tracy highlighted as sort of the locally identified issue number 1. Came up with an approach based on an assessment of where that pattern's already occurring and where it could potentially occur in the future or intensify in the future. Looking at current standards for residential use, for allowances for both private residential docks and joint use private docks, and how those were working for residential properties, and also we're creating some challenges for private lakeside recreational use activities. A consideration of the impacts that are occurring from this intensification of use, and then providing recommendations to improve management for this activity in the future. And then, as I mentioned before, support with drafting the code. So for the first effort, looking at consistency with updated state guidelines, I think for those of you that have looked at the periodic review checklist that was completed for the city's SMP, you're really seeing that generally the city's shoreline management program is consistent and remains consistent with all of the updated shoreline guidelines that have been either adopted by legislature as codified in the state's RCW or implemented through updates to the guidelines, the implementing guidelines that ecology puts in place through the what's called the WAC, the Washington State Administrative Code. So those date back to 2007, basically the time that the last round of comprehensive updates and guidelines were made by the state of Washington. So the checklist is organized in that year-by-year approach, dating back to from 2017 to 2007. Really, from 2007 to 2016, we saw almost no need for changes that needed to occur. If you're reviewing that checklist, almost every one of the lines going through the table are listed as not applicable, no update required, and there's some that are identified as optional updates. Predominantly, where it says no update required or optional, either the code is already consistent with what the state's guidelines say, and that's true for a lot of the really old, like the 2007, 2008, 2009 type situations. Where not applicable, it has to do frequently with saltwater activities, things like aquaculture, gooey duck harvesting, commercial shellfish activities, those things that aren't occurring in the city of Sammamish. And then the optional updates frequently have to do with sort of the state's responsibilities for setting a schedule for periodic updates or other things that really don't have a whole lot of relevance to local management of the Lake Sammamish shoreline, Pine Lake, and Beaver Lake. So really, they're there, the state's made those updates, but there's no relevance and no need to put them in the city's code. One thing coming out of, I think it was a 2009 change in the state's rules, was a minor update to provide some additional relief for shoreline restoration projects. If you guys looked into the detail of that update, basically all it's doing is saying if a city proposed project or a private property owner decided to do something along the shoreline that moved back the ordinary high water mark, so set back the shoreline to provide restoration and enhancement of those shoreline functions. And from that project, 200 feet extended further landward onto someone's property that wasn't previously under shoreline jurisdiction, it provides some relief where the city has the ability to basically say that the restoration project can occur without expanding the overall footprint of shoreline jurisdiction. So it's trying to eliminate one of the negative consequences that can sort of occur in an unintended way from restoration projects. So that update did seem useful and relevant to putting into the code. And then there were a handful of updates based on 2017 state guideline changes that were made. There's a one sentence update to the definition of development just to clearly indicate that it does not include development from a shoreline management perspective, does not include dismantling and or removal of structures. So that's just maintaining consistency with the state code and potentially eliminating a point of confusion if some sort of temporary structure was put in place within shoreline jurisdiction, potentially in a park, and asking questions about whether or not a permit would be required. Clarifying exceptions to local review authority. Those are fairly focused and the kind of things that won't likely really ever come up in the city of Sammamish, but it just ensures that that consistency is maintained. Shoreline permit filing procedures, that has to do with sort of the date of filing with the Department of Ecology. There's many shoreline permits that require, well, all shoreline permits have to be filed with the Department of Ecology, and some of them, Ecology has to sort of concur. They issue their own permit decision for conditional uses and shoreline variances. So just ensuring that there's sort of a very clear consistency between the local SMP and what the state's process is important, just to make sure things don't get crosswise. Then a minor update having to do with forestry practices, which are probably pretty infrequent, especially in shoreline jurisdiction within the city of Sammamish, but that just if someone came in for a private timber cutting permit from WDNR, and that's all that they were doing, that would not require a shoreline permit. I don't know if that's ever going to be something that comes up within the city, yeah. And then finally, integration, just to add some additional consistency with Ecology's standard language on non-conforming uses and non-conforming development activities. That was done in a way that also maintains sort of the city's existing development approach. So there was a fair amount of effort that went into the code to provide some limited allowances for existing homes and other structures that weren't entirely consistent with the SMP that was adopted in 2011. Some relatively sort of small allowances for improvements to those existing structures. So we look to create additional consistency with the ecology guidance without disrupting all that work and effort and thought that was put into the shoreline management approach specific to the city of Sammamish. And that really covers the whole checklist, and we're happy to talk more about sort of specific questions that you have. But if you're looking at the code, really, you're not going to see a whole lot of changes, except in one particular section having to do with this focused review topic on lakeside recreational lots. Our approach, working with the city staff did a query of the parcel database to identify lots where they've been getting shoreline permit requests for shared use docks, large dock type facilities, I think is the primary thing that sort of has been coming in, that of a development activity that requires a shoreline permit. And through those permits, the city managed to identify 6 lots where really this pattern is actively occurring and pretty clearly seen, and an additional 7 where recent permit requests have come in, so there's potential for a future dock on an undeveloped property where there's not one right now, and along with that dock, likely anticipated intensification of use. So just to step back momentarily, kind of the overall pattern of what the city's been seeing is it's relatively small lots generally that can't support, or it would be very challenging to permit a single-family residence. These are established, privately owned lots of legal record, generally under 4,000 square feet in size, kind of squeezed between the East Lake Sammamish Trail and the shoreline itself. There's a long history. You know, the lot pattern's been established for decades, and there's been some recreational use on them by those private owners for some time. I think as people, and maybe potentially because of property values increasing along the Lake Sammamish shoreline, sort of some increasing pressure to figure out ways to maybe increase the recreational opportunity on the properties. So owners, there's been a little bit more of a pattern where what might have been previously a single owner is creating an ownership group through some structure where there's multiple families, multiple people that are all seasonally using these properties for recreational use. Sometimes access is challenging. There's, as with many of the properties along the Lake Sammamish shoreline. Those private drives coming in create access challenges, and for many of these lots, there's actually no existing improved vehicular access down to the properties. So it's walk-in access, which also then creates challenges with garbage, refuse, disposal, and there's also generally no restroom facilities on any of these properties as well. So it's kind of the informal nature of the recreational use. The city has definitely seen a handful, somewhere around 13 lots, where it's been intensifying since the last comprehensive update of the SMP, and sort of seeing more of these permit requests coming, wanted to ensure that some focused review was occurring. In total, just doing a query of the parcel database, there's approximately 35 to 40 total lots. So that includes the 13 where potentially this private lakeside recreational use pattern could occur. This image is highlighting one of the lots. It does have an existing dock. You're seeing multiple mooring buoys out in front. You also see kind of what we started to see as a consistent pattern where there is a lot of small craft, various sort of lawn chairs, other types of stuff up on the beach, and a fair amount of clearing of vegetation that's occurred over the last 5 to 10 years associated with the sort of intensification of use right along the shoreline. Here's another example, fairly consistent with the previous.
Excuse me 1 second. You can make public comment at the end during public comment time.
Another lot with a fairly consistent pattern as the previous. Again, sort of clearing of the understory vegetation, especially right along the shoreline. And I think, was that the same as the first one? No, I think that this is a different one. Even more boats moored out front, and a lot of sort of recreation associated stuff located on the shoreline. And then the third slide is, this is just an example of a lot that the city has, I think, recently received a permit request for a new overwater structure on it that would provide joint use. And clearly you can see that this pattern is sort of more of what you see for undeveloped lots that aren't getting this kind of higher intensity recreational activity in the summertime. A lot of understory vegetation, a lot less sort of really apparent use of the shoreline. So we went through.
Aaron, I'm sorry, is it okay if I ask questions a couple
I think
as
that's
we go?
fine, yeah.
Tell me no if you don't
No,
want to do
totally,
it.
it's great.
So can you, I guess I'm struggling a little bit to understand kind of in an oversimplified way, what's wrong. So when I look at some of these, I think, what's wrong? Mm-hmm. And in this case in particular, that looks very natural and that's great. But if that happens to be part of a lot that's large enough to build a house, they're going to get a permit and take a bunch of that stuff down, right? So I'm trying to figure out, if it becomes a joint use lot and they want to put in a dock and clear it, what's wrong with that? Is that the same standard as if somebody's building a house there, or what's, and when I see boats moored, can you help us understand in the context of the shoreline management, what it is we're looking at that doesn't fit in with the goals and objectives of the shoreline management plan that we have or that we're talking about?
Yeah, I definitely would say that appropriate use of the shoreline and residential shoreline development is actually mandated and encouraged by the State Department of Ecology and the state guidelines as one of the sort of preferred shoreline uses. But so whatever a shoreline jurisdiction like Sammamish decides is an appropriate use activity along that shoreline, whether it's Lake Sammamish shoreline or Pine or Beaver Lake, that's acceptable. And I think that appropriate use and development is encouraged by the Shoreline Management Act. It's just that what the city has been seeing is sort of, it's these private properties within a pattern of private residential single-family properties where it's kind of a new use activity that's occurring that really wasn't captured and identified as a specific use by your existing shoreline master program. And with the permit requests that have been coming in for that sort of development, it's become a bit of a management issue. And I think the key things that are concerns for the city is sort of this unplanned, unmanaged impact to the shoreline itself and the vegetation. So it's people using the property, clearing of vegetation, whether it's intentional or through trampling. You get more bank erosion on the lake bank itself. So you're all of a sudden you're starting to lose some of that bank, and which can lead to requests for shoreline armoring. All of those changes to that fringe along the lake shoreline has effects on the salmon populations that use the lake for juvenile outmigration, for returning back. They rely on these shoreline areas for outmigration, for rearing. You know, I don't know if you've heard about kokanee salmon, but it's a population I'm sure you have that's on the brink in Lake Sammamish, and it critically relies on a few of the tributary streams and the lake itself for its life cycle, for its habitat and survival. So sort of these incremental impacts to the vegetation occurring right along the banks definitely have implications for the fish and for wildlife that are associated with the lake. The other things that are occurring, you know, with sort of undermanaged and under sort of planned for recreational use from multiple boats and from multiple parties that are coming down, there's greater potential for water quality impacts, both from fuel spills, from bathroom activities that really aren't happening in a improved facility, and from just general refuse not being disposed of appropriately. So those are the sort of additional kind of water quality character of, and also character of kind of the property and maintenance of the property that's been occurring and has been seen by the city.
So thank you for that, Aaron. I think I understood this process to be that, you know, that maybe we have guidelines for single-family homes, but we don't have specific guidelines for recreational use, and how can we make sure that it's standardized and codified? So thank you for explaining that.
Exactly.
I just had a quick question on two things. The checklist that we see in here is from 2017, so does the department come up with checklist every year, and how will we address the checklist for 2018? So
the periodic review checklist looked to all of the guidelines that led to this currently mandated round of periodic review. So you're not going to see another mandate for periodic review for another 8 years. And at that time, you know, it takes time for ecology and for the state to unroll the process. So they decided for this round of periodic reviews, they're trying to ensure that all jurisdictions become compliant with guidelines from 2007 to 2017. The next round of periodic review, 8 years down the road, all of a sudden then those additional guideline changes will be required.
Oh, so that checklist was from 2007 to 17, and we need to catch up with all of them. So,
Exactly.
I thought it was like sent every year.
No, it's sort of
cumulative.
Yeah, it's cumulative. So you're not going to see another sort of expectation for a periodic review round to ensure consistency for another 8 years.
Okay. Yep. And then with the state comment period, how does that work along with the city?
So because we choose the joint review process, so we will have the same 30 days public comment period as state. So as city will send a public hearing notice within 30 days public comments period starting on May 7th through June 6th. So the public hearing will end the exact same day of the joint hearing date. And the state, on their side, they will also send their own public hearing notice, and they will have the exactly same public comment period. So the purpose is to gather, consolidate both comment periods, then we have all the comments within the same period of time, then we have time to respond to those comments in the same time.
So the state comment will be for what plan?
The same, will be the same day from,
No, which plan will the comments be on? Is that on the Sammamish or the Shoreline Master Plan?
Yes.
So it's on the
Yes.
Shoreline? Okay. Thank you.
I derailed you there a little bit, Aaron. Why don't you continue? But
no
I would
problem.
like-
Yeah, and I was
would like
nearing-
just a little more context with those pictures. That's why
For
I
sure,
asked.
definitely. And I think, yeah, I kind of talk through some of the impacts that we were seeing. And really, I mean, from this review, it was based on city's experience with the permit requests that have come in, and sort of the context and information that they were able to provide from that. And then it really was this sort of comparative review of shoreline oblique photos, which is what is included in the memo and which we were highlighting. Luckily, those oblique photos have been taken at a couple of different times in a series. I think it's a helicopter flight along the shoreline. So there's the most recent, I think, was 2016, and I think maybe it was a 2016, 2017 joint effort, and then the previous round dated back to around 2007. So it provided an opportunity to see some of the change. So the last two slides I had really were just to kind of quickly highlight the recommendations that we provided that are summarized at the end of the memo, and that if you're reviewing the code itself, we drafted as 25.07.130, and that's starting on page 39 of Exhibit 2. So what that section is doing is defining a new use category. So along with residential use, with park uses, all of the sort of primary uses that occur within the city's shoreline jurisdiction, private lakeside recreational use is defined as a new category. Within the permitted use table, which is up higher, I think 25.07010 on page 26 of Exhibit 2, you'll see that there's new lines added to that table that sort of define 4 subcategories for this private lakeside recreational use. Those are looking at single ownership, so a person or a family that has ownership and is just maintaining ownership of this property for their own personal use. That's one category. And then a second category is for an HOA that's for adjoining residential properties. And we define adjoining to include properties that are either, immediately abutting the parcel, the lakeside recreational access parcel, or are immediately on the other side of the East Lake Sammamish Trail. So those that would provide joint use for 2 to 9 properties, that's defined as a second use category. Those first 2 would all require just a standard shoreline substantial development permit. So there would be no sort of additional scrutiny through a conditional use permit. The final 2 categories, however, which would be an HOA, an adjoining or abutting HOA, providing access for more than 9, so 10 or more properties, would require conditional use. And then a property that was owned by any more than two or more parties that were not members of an adjoining homeowners association, that would also require a conditional use with some additional criteria established for that conditional use review within 2507.130. There's approval criteria that are established for any private lakeside recreational use. The minimum standards applicable to all clarify the maximum overwater coverage that would be allowed. It clearly provides consistency with what's allowed for private residential docks. So it provides direct reference to that code section. It clarifies expectations for vegetation enhancement area. That's already a requirement under the shoreline code that within this shoreline setback, a shoreline vegetation enhancement area has to be established. with allowances for an active use portion. What it's doing is just for private lakeside recreational uses where there's not always a massive amount of new structure and new development occurring. It's setting some clear expectations as to what that shoreline vegetation enhancement area needs to look like and how sort of those areas of focused active use need to be differentiated from the rest of the shoreline vegetation. And then reasonable plans for site access, garage and recycle disposable, and accommodation to bathroom facilities for properties that are providing only seasonal use for a single family or a single owner, or for I think 2 or 3 owner. I forget exactly what we state, and I will look it up. Basically, the minimum expectation is that seasonally, like an outhouse with an enclosure would be available there for a porta potty. For a HOA, where there's adjoining improved properties with the homeowners have presumably homes with restrooms. Maybe those restroom requirements aren't as necessary. So it's private lakeside recreational use lots serving between 2 and 3 owners that are not party to an adjoining residential homeowners association could, at minimum, provide a porta potty seasonally to support that seasonal recreational use. For any development serving 4 or more owners that are not party to an adjoining homeowners association would be required to provide an on-site bathroom with public utility hookup. So a higher expectation, a higher cost, but there's a higher intensity of activity occurring at that point. And then the final slide is just the expectations that are specific to those private recreational use properties that require conditional use permit. So all of a sudden, requirements for establishing off-street parking as part of sort of appropriate provisions for access are required, appropriate location to have garbage and recycle facilities on the property. So just like a home is required to have a spot to provide for garbage and recycle bins, it would be required for these properties as well. And as I just discussed, the restroom facilities requirements gets to be a bit more stringent, and from our perspective, appropriately stringent for those proposals requiring a conditional use permit. And where not associated with an adjoining HOA, limiting the number of owners. So just setting a standard that, a relatively small property that's privately owned cannot serve more than 9 joint members. So setting a maximum threshold on that, just so it doesn't become a highly used private park on a relatively small lot in shoreline jurisdiction.
I wanted to follow up a little bit on the chair's question, and I think it's still on track. I tried to do some research in this, and I know I've heard it in meetings before, and I didn't find it. So what are the specifications? Let's just talk about Lake Sammamish for easements. How far out do the different municipalities, which I think are 4 that border Lake Sammamish, who owns the water and where? And you mentioned high water mark, and I remember that as being important. So is it 100 feet out? I saw the lines on the property there. So I hope I made sense. I just couldn't find this anyplace.
Yeah, just to clarify, the lines on that were only just for illustrative purposes and just were very approximate. Those aren't legal parcel lines at all. I don't know, maybe David or Tracy, about the extent of jurisdiction.
Yeah,
So it's interesting because in different parts of the lakes, there's different ownership. There's actually a really good guide put out by Chicago Title Company, a guide to waterfront titles that I'm happy to forward on to you guys. It talks a lot about how you draw boundaries on properties, how far out they go, who owns what, how to know who owns what. There are instances where the Washington State Department of Natural Resources owns the mudland under the lake, and somebody has to go to them to put a dock on their land. There are other instances where the property owner owns the mudland under the lake and has the right to put a dock in place, but the public has the right to navigate up to the ordinary high water mark. You can't get out of your boat and walk and fly fish, for example, but you can float in a boat and fly fish. It's a whole host of different rules. We have done an inquiry with Washington State Department of Natural Resources and asked them whether or not they have claim to ownership of any of the mudlands under the waterfront properties along the lake. Their response was no, they don't. So we know from that report out from the Department of Natural Resources that they do not have interest in any of the mudlands in the city limits. There are other areas where they might have interest outside of city limits, but based on our formal communication with DNR, they do not have interest in any of the mudlands in the city. So that is a distinctive point, because what that means is that the adjoining property owners own down into the water and have a right. Now, how far out that ownership goes, that's a whole nother question. The title document describes more detail how to determine that. With regard to jurisdiction, King County typically takes jurisdiction of the middle of the lake. However, as I understand it, our jurisdiction extends out to Bellevue's jurisdiction. So it's kind of a wash as to who wants to claim jurisdiction. Along the lake for the purpose of enforcement, there is a King County sheriff's boat that's moored out of Vassar Park down on the southwest shore of the lake. One of the biggest issues I feel that we face on the lake itself with regard to navigation and operation of boating and vessels is that there is no fueling facility on the lake. There was a fuel barge that was in operation for a period of time, off and on. However, they got sideways with the Bellevue Fire Department, and the Bellevue Fire Chief and Fire Marshal shut it down for a period of time. I'm not familiar as to the outcome of some of the legal appeals that were ongoing between the city of Bellevue and that fire barge or that fuel barge facility. It may be back in service. I don't know. I haven't heard. I need to check in with them.
In the last 5 years, I've never seen it out there.
So that was historically the only way to fuel your boat without actually either schlepping cans down to the lake or pulling your boat out on a private or public boat lift, hauling it to a fueling station, fueling it, and putting it back in the water again. So one of the issues that was raised numerous times to us by several different parties was the concern around the proliferation of boating facilities. When you don't have a boating facility, you're required to take your boat out of the water at the end of the day, whether a private or a public boat launch. And by putting it on the trailer, that facilitates your ability to actually fuel your boat. By leaving it on a mooring buoy or on a dock, you end up trying to fuel your boat from the dock yourself, which many people have cited is one of the biggest issues with water quality, is the spillage that goes along with that. The Washington State Parks boating program actually identifies that as a major issue. So much of what you're seeing here is resultant from public comment we receive. We do have quite a few citizens along the parkway that are concerned with the proliferation of these types of activities. And they have, as part of our permitting for these types of facilities, raised these issues to us. However, these facilities represent a loophole in our regulations because our vegetation enhancement area is typically something that is implemented through development above the ordinary high water mark within the shoreline setback. It is something that if you're not actually meeting the definition of development, you're able to skirt. So what we see is that when somebody builds a dock is typically located below the ordinary high water mark, as opposed to above the ordinary high water mark. So there's a distinctive loophole in our code right now that some of these applicants have actually turned around to us and said, well, make me do it. You can't make me do it. I'm not going to implement the vegetation enhancement area. Too bad. And we then hear from their attorney. And because our code does not actually require it, because it's related to a specific type and form of development that occurs above the ordinary high water mark, we have no way to actually have the appropriate, what was seen at the point of adoption in 2011 of the Shoreline Master Program as appropriate mitigation measures for development, even for residential development, we're not seeing happen on these projects because the people that are pursuing these permits are not wanting to do it voluntarily. So what we see is a loophole. Really what this comes back to, and I think that Aaron and Tracy were trying to describe it is that in the major update process that began in 2008, ended in 2011, the city was required to put together a set of regulations that met the state guidelines. And what the city then was required to do was to demonstrate that the anticipated application of these these regulations at the rate of development that was forecasted and modeled based on past activity. So we went in our permit system and we said, okay, over the last 10 years, we've done this many of this type of permits. We anticipate that this many more will come in. We have this many lots that are eligible for these types of permits. What was not recognized was this use. So all of these lots, these 35 to 40 or whatever it was lots, were taken out of the equation and thought that nothing would really happen here because you couldn't put a house on it. But now what we're seeing is a level of intensity on these lots that is equal to what was happening on residential lots. So this is important because we as a city are responsible to be stewards of a shoreline of the state. It's a state resource. And the state expects that the city takes appropriate actions to offset and ensure no net loss of ecological function. So when we gave the state our what's called cumulative impacts assessment, we told the state, hey state, we think that this is the rate of development that will occur on the shoreline over the next cycle of development. These are the rules that will apply, and this is why we think that when considering the rate of development, the intensity of what's going on, and the mitigation measures that will be implemented, i.e. the vegetation enhancement area with each project that comes through, that we will, that in cumulative impact, we will have no net loss of ecological function. So what that did not include, as a matter of a loophole, was this type of use and this type of activity. So now we are simply trying to correct our code to address something that was not properly addressed at the last update because we are seeing a level of intensity that was not anticipated and potentially could lead to a net loss of ecological function, which is contrary to what the state mandate is for us to do in our obligation to be stewards of a shoreline of the state.
Aaron, were you finished?
Yes, this is actually my last slide, so I am finished. Yep.
All right. So I presume if we can have a period for questions. I have a number that I actually had emailed, and I have a few more, but I'll wait and let other commissioners ask their questions. Don't make me look.
I can, go ahead, Mark.
I have a question on the tribe's involvement. I'm curious as to what their stake in this matter is with city. Is part of the Lake Sammamish part of their lands, or why are they so involved in this?
They have fishing treaty rights, so they have interest in the fisheries, and what their interest is protection of aquatic habitat, as that directly corresponds to water quality and to fish health. And it's not just one type of fish they're interested in, and that's the issue here, is that our definition, as was developed many years ago, really focuses on salmonids, one type of fish, and they're interested in changing the definition to protect habitat as it relates to all fish, because what they see there is that that increases habitat, that increases the, I don't know what the right term is, I want to say the benthic index that goes along with a typical water course where it eventually reaches the confluence of the lake.
Thank you.
Hopefully mine is quick again, and let's just talk about Lake Sammamish, because I didn't see that timber cutting thing when I looked through our notes, but now it came to my mind how to word this. If Lake Sammamish, if any things run downhill into it, so any timber cutting should affect something. So go.
I guess, yeah, I would say you're right that changes in land cover do have implications for, a stream, for wetlands, and for the shorelines. This specific update to the state guidelines, it was only relevant to forest practices within shoreline jurisdiction. So it's just, if you have land within shoreline jurisdiction, it's not developed, and, if you elected to cut down the trees for timber harvest, it would not require a shoreline permit. There would be other review requirements. The State Department of Natural Resources for private timber harvest has a slew of regulations to try to ensure that what you're talking about, the implications from timber harvest, are addressed. But they're not particularly relevant to sort of activity that could occur within the city's shoreline jurisdiction.
Thank you, Aaron.
Yeah.
All right, I have a number of concerns about this language, frankly. And I started to express some of those previously, but I want to get into them just a bit. One of the things I don't quite understand is what exactly it is that's changed. And when I say that, so for example, I know that Inglewood Hill neighborhood has had a community shoreline component for, I don't know, decades, at least 30 years, I think. So those have existed. To say that this is a new use isn't quite right, because those have existed for a long time. But my perception is that the intensity of use or the number of these uses is what's changed. To me, in order to make things, to have language that's reasonable, it needs to recognize more technically what it is that we're trying to get at. And I think saying that the change is that now there's more lots than there used to be doesn't really get at the heart of what's going on here. So, and here's I mentioned this before to David, but this is what I'm concerned about. If our concern is that we have a small lot that 5 people get together and they all moor their boats out there and they build a dock, what's wrong with that, right? We haven't defined what's technically a problem there. And so what I'm getting at is, if we put something like this in place and haven't defined the technical aspects, then those 5 people, instead of doing what they did, can change the way they did it and have one person be the owner, and then there's really no rules that apply, and all the rest of them can still use it, and they can give the guy some money or do whatever, arrange something else, right? And until we define the technical problem, we're not really going to solve the problem. We're just going to create different ways for people to do the same thing. And I guess I think if part of the problem is that, and that's one question I had too, is if part of the problem is overwater coverage, I don't necessarily know, do moored boats contribute to overwater coverage? And if they do, then that's not allowed use anyway, and that's an enforcement issue. But if they don't, then I'm not sure in that situation how we're accomplishing very much with this. Another comment, I'm just going to run through a few of them here. Another comment I have is this, frankly, in some respects, seems like a de facto prohibition on some people's property use, because if you say you have to have a porta potty and garbage service on some of these lots and put in parking, but they don't have access to a road, you've essentially put in a prohibition that says you can no longer use that lot of whatever size for anything other than X, right? So you can no longer have, well, I think 3 people have to have a porta potty. I can't remember now. But if 3 owners have to have a porta potty, regardless of the size of the lot, if they don't have road access, they can't have a porta potty. I mean, they're not going to haul it out by hand, right? So they can no longer get a permit to use the property that they have. I think some of this goes back to my concern that we're not addressing the technical issues very well. We're dealing with ownership issues. Another question I'd really like to understand, why are we treating, and there's probably a reason for this that I just haven't heard yet, why are we treating adjacent, is that the right word, adjacent? Adjacent property owners different than non-adjacent property owners. If you've got 5 people that are not actually on the lake, they're across the road, and they want to use this piece of property, how is that use different than 5 people who are 2 miles away? I don't understand why they're being treated differently. What's the purpose of that?
Yeah, the reason that the allowance for, those different sub-use or, different use types were established is basically to recognize that, whether they're immediately adjoining or right across the trail or right across the parkway, that the availability of the restrooms, of the garbage facilities, of parking at those adjoining properties is going to minimize many of the upland, sort of the shoreland impacts that we're trying to address through these standards. Whereas if it's a joint use property that's owned by people coming from 2 miles away, or anywhere that's not easily a walk to and from the shoreline access property and shoreline recreation property, that all of a sudden sort of the availability and ease of use for those adjacent improvements is not going to be there, which from our perspective is what triggered the requirement for additional standards and sort of some additional criteria for how that type of development could
And I think that makes
occur.
good technical sense. I think my sense of it is, I'm not an expert with the language, it'd be good to somehow, with a few words, point that out in here so that people understand why they're being treated differently.
Can I add one thing to that?
Yeah, sure.
The microphone on here. So a lot of this goes back to the structure of the actual Shoreline Management Act and the enabling legislation and the subsequent shoreline guidelines that the state passed. So you're not, under the rules, really allowed to have a dock unless it's associated with an upland use. So you can't just put a dock on a property on the shoreline. There has to be, in accordance with the state law, an associated upland use. It has to be in appurtenance to or subordinate to an upland use, and that is a very important distinction. So there typically are three categories that you would see where a dock would be allowed. One is as a subordinate to or an appurtenance to a single-family residence. So for those properties that have adjoining HOAs that happen to own a remnant parcel across the parkway or across the King County Trail, those are considered to be subordinate to the residential use that's across the street. So that's one of the reasons why we classified that way. Another incidence where you would have a dock is associated with a private park. That's why we included the private park use for those that are not anchored to a residential use. So the dock would be subordinate to and appurtenant to the private park use of the parcel. That would be permitted. It would have to be, we're thinking about uses along the shoreline and recognizing uses. The third one would be, and this is one that really is where you see the boating activity and where most cities' shoreline master programs push the boating activity to, is a marina, which is the appropriate location to concentrate boating activity because you can have pump out stations, restroom facilities, bathroom facilities, you can have parking facilities, and all of those things that we're seeing in a pressure to add as a diffuse use along the shoreline as opposed to a concentrated point where you can manage it. So when you think about this, and one of the reasons why we structured it this way is that it goes back to, and I'd be happy to take you on a tour of our lovely Shoreline Management Act and the enabling legislation and show you those points in the guidelines where it specifically says that docks are only allowed when subordinate to primary upland uses.
So then I'm slightly confused. If that's the case, then does that apply to this at all? Because if those restrictions already exist, then what is this doing to docks that's different than the restrictions we already have?
Because we don't actually have it in our local shoreline master program. Our shoreline master program only contemplated residential docks. And in this case, we're seeing uses that are not residential docks and that are being pushed through sort of in a loophole environment because of the structure of our code.
Okay. The parking requirements, again, this feels like in many instances, I mean, I'm curious if there's really only 30 or 40 lots. Oh, I think you said there were more than that potentially, but how many of those instances is parking even feasible? Again, by putting a parking restriction in place, it seems like a kind of a de facto prohibition on the use of that property because, I mean, frankly, along the lake, parking is a challenge almost no matter what because of the density of the way the houses are built and the way that they access them. So if we require 2 parking stalls, I understand why, I absolutely understand why, but again, it feels like we will have a difficult time with that just because it doesn't seem very feasible.
Yeah, as part of our review, you know, when we were identifying these potential parcels, we did map them, but we did not do sort of that level of detailed analysis of which ones, you know, had an adjoining unimproved right-of-way and adjoining improved right-of-way. So I couldn't tell you what those numbers are. From looking at the obliques and just kind of the condition of them, I definitely agree that, you know, there are a fair number that are walk-in properties currently and are sort of designated as only accessible that way. And I think that that's part of the parcel record is, you know, the access, whether it's walk-in or has an adjacent improved right-of-way. So we probably could get that information and provide it. But yes, I mean, I think the sort of the triggers for when parking would be expected and sort of along with that opportunity for reasonable garbage and recycling facilities was trying to say that, you know, if you have a private recreational use that's going to have a certain intensity that's beyond one family or for the HOA situation, providing recreational access for more than 9 adjoining surrounding homes, that then in those situations, there should be an expectation that there is available off-street parking and access to that property to minimize this sort of unplanned, unmanaged use and access that the city is starting to see as occurring.
And I understand all that, but I would again point out that I bet if we went through and looked at these 40 lots, almost none of them can put in 2 parking stalls reasonably, because that's probably why they are the way they are. So what you're doing is essentially saying no one can use any of these other than for a couple of families, right? And I from the standpoint of preserving the lakeside, the environment, I completely agree with that. But there are people who own property down there that certainly will not agree with that. And I think we need to take their interests into consideration as well as the environmental interests, because that's part of our job, is to balance all of this stuff together and try to find ways to live within the Department of Ecology's requirements while still providing people to utilize their property as they can.
So we could definitely look at that, and I hear what you're saying. It's kind of like there are some that are fundamentally unable to provide parking, period. They don't have access to a road or a private easement or a driveway or anything. One of the issues we've heard in public comment in numerous occasions through the permitting process for some of the ones we've dealt with was that, and this has been raised in hearing, and our hearing examiners asked similar questions, is that if you don't have parking and you're building a 10-unit dock, and no one is anchored to an HOA, where are these 10 families parking when they want, how are they getting here? Are they just coming in a helicopter? And I think that's exactly what the hearing examiner said. Once, are they arriving by helicopter? Well, the issue there is that if you're not a local resident of that area, someone has to park their car somewhere. And the issue has come up, and it's been raised by other community members down there, that the city and the county and other forums, in different forums, are going through to great lengths to find locations to build parking for the users of the trail, not for the users of those privately owned shoreline properties. And what happens is that if someone's hosting a party on their property and they're going to walk down there, and they're from out of town or they're from a different part of the city, they're not locally down there, they're going to fill up the public parking for those facilities for their private use. And that's something that has been raised on numerous occasions. There has to be a balance that can be struck. The other issue is that it's the massing of stuff. So one of the builders who was building one of these facilities identified that, hey, we're going to get all our stuff down there. We're going to have these carts, and we're going to cart our stuff down in these like wheelbarrow-like carts. And what's going to happen is we're going to then park those on the trail, and we're going to carry all of our gas cans, our boating stuff, our, all this stuff down, our barbecue stuff, and we're going to lock the carts to the fence along the trail. So then we're left with an impact to the main public use down there, which is the trail use, by people just leaving their wheelbarrows down there along the fence. There's all these things that we've heard through public comment. The next one is, what happens with trash? Where does that go? And I'm aware that the county has granted special use permit to different individual owners along the water to allow for a porta potty pump truck to come through on a regular basis. So we do have indication that you can feasibly have a porta potty, because they actually do allow for that porta potty servicing to occur by way of the trail.
Only if the truck can get to it.
But what the truck does is it goes down the trail corridor. I see your point, but there is some balance that can be struck there.
The one other thing that I had pointed out, and I hope you'll look at this in 25.07.130, item 4, and I included this in my written comments so you could reference it there. The first sentence feels a little, and I'm not sure that it's the right way to describe what the intent is. I think it'd be good to look at that language and make certain that that's necessary and what it says. I think that probably some modifications, I'd certainly be more comfortable with some modified language there. So if you'd just please take a look at that and make sure you're okay with that. The last thing I would point out is more of a statement. I actually have a boat on the lake. And I can tell you that, yes, absolutely, I carry gas cans down and put gas in my boat. And so do every single one of those property owners that have a home along the side of the lake that are telling you that. So it's not just these 30 or 40 lots that are the risk. It's also the people who have a boat on the lake out in front of their house because there's no fueling facility. So they're all doing exactly the same thing, including everybody on the Bellevue side. So I'm not sure that's a bigger issue that probably is not about this. Yeah, it's about the fact that there's no fuel available on the lake. And that gets to another point that I think is a little, I hesitate to say it, but I mentioned it earlier. I want to be careful that the city considers the concern that there could be a perception that in order to have access to the lake now, you only have a few spots. You have a couple parks. If you want boat access, you have one boat ramp, some private ones, but one public boat ramp. The more restrictions we put on people using their property to access the lake, the more we're exclusivizing access to a public entity. So I want to be careful that we're also balancing that concern, because some of these people that are 3 and 4 and 5 families who would love to have access to the lake but don't have $4 million to buy a house on the lake, may be able to, in the right circumstances, with some reasonable rules, get access to the lake. And frankly, I as someone who has a boat on the lake, I don't want more people on the lake because it's busy and rough. And but I understand while people have a desire to get access to that private resource, and if we're putting in place further restrictions on providing access to people that aren't multimillionaires, we need to be cautious about how we do that and make sure that we're balancing appropriately the needs of what's there right now with other people that would like to utilize their property. So that's just my comment to close the questions that I had.
If I could follow up to that
Sure.
comment, so for us, this represents the comments that we've heard over the years in permitting these types of facilities. And what we did was we brought to you a set of rules that were in draft form that we felt addressed the width of comments that we've heard. If there are some of the items, if some of the items included in here are ones that you feel are overreaching, are not really on point, maybe sort of not really addressing what the issue might be, they can be eliminated. So really, this was our best attempt at trying to address the full width of issues that we've seen raised in public hearings, on appeals. We've received appeals. One of the appellants is here in the room. Maybe they'll indicate why they were appealing a project we were working on. So we're really trying to address some of the public concern around these types of facilities, because they are facilities at the end of the day. And if you feel these rules are, if we should have some sort of rule, and maybe we try and right size it, we'll take your comments here and we'll try and turn the dial. If you feel that we really shouldn't be pursuing this and you wanted to all sort of pass off that comment of, hey, we really don't need to address this, it's not an issue, we'll happily go on our way and pursue just the standard periodic review. But this is something that we do come across routinely in permitting on the shoreline, and we felt it was appropriate for us to have a conversation about it. And we put our minds together and thought about all the things we've heard and how we could address those items. So that's what this represents.
And I will just add that as the naysayer here tonight, I do appreciate the work that's been done. I understand this is a real issue and needs some work to try to get it reined in a bit. I'm just hopeful we can provide some balance and that not only is reasonable for people, but also doesn't put us in a position of then having to go back and revisit again and again to try to, dial it to something that will work and not represent a bunch of legal challenges and so on. So I do really appreciate the work that's been done. Thank you. Anybody else comments? Mark?
Yeah, I have a couple comments, and I do appreciate the work you've put in too. It's obvious there's a lot of work that goes involved in this, but as somebody that does not have a boat, or, well, I have a canoe, but I don't have a motorboat, and I don't have property on the lake, I would love to have a boat and property on the lake. And if I could not afford a house, I would use that property in the summertime to have picnics and entertain my friends, and it's my property. I don't understand the issue. Now, if they're leaving carts on the trail, that's an issue, but that's an issue that needs to be addressed without restricting their freedom to enjoy their property the way they see fit, as long as it falls within ecological rules that are already on the books. So I agree with the chairman that we have to be very cautious and not get into overreach here and try to balance the objections of the people that have been making these complaints with the freedoms of the people that own the property to use their property the way they see fit. I do have a question considering what you said about unintended use. I don't go to the city to determine how I can use my property. And I don't think the city's role is to tell me what I can and cannot do to that extent. I understand there has to be rules. I've built a building on my property and fought the city for 6 months over a permit that was absolutely ridiculous. So it seems that the city overreaches sometimes with good intent, but it's the perspective and the perception of the city that they have the right to do this that kind of bothers me, that this overreach seems to be routine. Somebody said the exception to the upland use was a private park. Is that correct? And the private park is how you're going to look at these properties? So, but they have to have a permit to have a private park? I think I heard that too.
So this goes back to, again, the structure of the Shoreline Management Act. So when we started this, we tried to describe a little bit about the basics regarding shorelines. Shoreline jurisdiction is where the city is in the role of serving as an agent to the state. And there is a much heightened level of scrutiny around what occurs. And there is actually a structure around what uses are allowed. So and I don't mean to be flippant to your comment. It's just there is actually a structure and a system around what uses are allowed along the shoreline. And that is exactly the purpose behind the Shoreline Management Act. What they don't want is uncoordinated, unrestricted, piecemeal type development where I call them nibblers, where a nibbler will go in and next thing you know, the whole thing is hardened, right? So what they do is they look at a prioritization of uses, and it's those uses, this use being one of them, being the private recreational use of the shoreline, is one that is given because it goes sort of along the water dependent is the first priority of use. Water related is the second priority of use, and then there's one more water
Associated?
water associated.
Oriented.
Water oriented is the third level of use. But the state really has, I would almost call it a prohibition on docks, unless the dock has an associated use that goes along with it that is the primary use of the shoreline. So
Recreation is not a primary use?
it is, but then what they would want to know is, well, what is the upland anchor use and how is that established? What sort of amenities go along with that? Because what the state has done through the passing of the act is they've anticipated that there will be certain types of activities that will be detrimental to the ecological function of the shoreline. And those activities typically are the clearing, the maintenance, the water quality disruption, all those things that go along with an intensity of concentrated use. When a use is concentrated and it's of a higher level of intensity, the act identifies that there is potential for degradation of that shoreline ecological process. So what the state act is saying is that if you want to allow for these priority uses, recreation, water dependent, water related, water oriented uses, that there also needs to be counterpart checks and balances on how are you going to contain that use to make sure that it doesn't cause a bigger and bigger footprint over time. How are you going to provide for mitigative measures along the shoreline to ensure that on balance there is no net loss of ecological function on a reach by reach basis, so that if you allow for an intensified portion of a property to be developed, that there's a portion of that property that is specifically set aside for ecological function through something like a vegetation enhancement area. So it is, depending on who you are, whether fortunately or unfortunately, there is a much higher level of scrutiny and expectation with regard to how we manage uses along the shoreline. One of the things that happened with the passing of the act was that there's all this information in the act about protection of ecological function, balancing of uses, and then there was this one sentence that was inserted into the act that says that, and there's a list of uses that are considered to be priority uses for modification of the shoreline. And the first one is private residential use. So what ends up happening is that the structure and the way the shoreline master programs are written, because of how the courts have ultimately fallen with regard to what the Shoreline Management Act says, is that shoreline residential uses, a home, is a priority use on the shoreline. The other uses that go along with that are water dependent, water oriented, water related, are also priority. However, those come further down the line in the statement of prioritization of uses. So it becomes this use hierarchy of how we want to manage our shorelines. So what we're trying to do is find a way to get people down to the shoreline, to allow for these private recreational uses to occur, to allow for docks to be built, to allow for them to enjoy the shoreline. But what is the right set of regulations that would ensure us that the use will not get out of control? It will not cause for a net loss of ecological function due to the intensification of use, the hardening, the trampling, the activity. So how do we balance all of that? And that's what we're asking here tonight is what is the right set of rules to have for these uses? And we could let it go, but the next time we come back to this again, and the next time the state looks at what's happened along our shoreline, as we are required to, they audit us basically on what's happening along our shorelines. And if they note that we are not in compliance with and not living up to the promise that we made through our cumulative impacts assessment, then there will have to be some stark changes. It could ultimately lead to a financial impact on the city, because the city is then obligated to increase its level of spending in shoreline restoration. When a city is looking at being compliant with the Shoreline Management Act, there are two fundamental pathways it can follow. Usually most cities have somewhat of a hybrid approach to it. On the one hand, a city can allow a lot of development on its shoreline, but it can also have a fairly robust shoreline restoration plan that is publicly funded, that identifies public purchase and ownership and holding of lands, restoration of those reaches of the shoreline that are in public ownership. And a lot of money can go into that to offset the development. On the other hand, a city can spend very little money or no money in shoreline restoration, not own land, not hold land, not improve land, and it can carry a fairly heavy stick with regard to shoreline development and put the onus on the individual private property owner to make net improvements over time to offset the degradation effect of development along the shoreline.
Okay, I'm going to stop you there. I think we're getting into the weeds a little bit too much. I completely understand, and I said that at the beginning, that there needs to be some regulations. What I'm concerned about is kind of what I came in contact with, when you have these 4,000, 5,000 square foot homes on postage stamp lots with very little permeable land left, and the city's challenging me when, with my addition, I had over 60% permeable land, and it was the way the words were written in the way the permitting was for contractors, but it affected all private owners too. That's what I'm concerned about, and that overreach, or that not thinking through the ramifications of some of the ideas that unduly, impact the property owner. That's my only concern, and I think we're going to be able to do that. So thank you very much.
I just had a comment. I just think where I firmly believe in the rights of an individual to develop their property, and I wholeheartedly believe in property rights. But then it's almost kind of the same situation that we find ourselves with Town Centre right now, where a property owner has a right to their land and develop their property as they see fit, but we have to balance that with the overall impact that has on our community at large. And so I find myself in a situation where I'm holding two opposing opinions because I wholeheartely believe that when you own a piece of property, you have a right to use it as you see fit because you are the owner of it. But I also am concerned with the health of our lake and the environmental impacts of its uses. So I'm going to be interested in learning more about this and learning more about how we can balance both of those two things, but keeping our lakes and our water healthy, but at the same time allowing our property owners to use that property in the way in which they always wanted to and desired to, and to the best use for their families. So it's a very interesting discussion. I find myself pushed and pulled in all kinds of directions. So I'm just interested in learning more.
I think, the last one on a whole nother topic, and that's item 5, the letter. And the word net loss came out a couple times. I have a lot of respect for the indigenous communities, and I was really impressed in their letter. What they seem to be doing is an all-inclusive demographic of fish. So they're not trying to single out this fish or that fish. They're trying to be the communities or the neighborhoods or all fish. And hopefully that will, no pun intended, but help the net stay someplace. And that's about it.
All right.
Well, thanks, staff, for working through this. We appreciate the presentation. I have a few comments and some questions. I'll start off with a question. It's kind of related to Mark's question earlier about, so as a percentage of the total lake lots, what percentage are these lots we're talking about? And maybe expanding on that, like, you know, if you had 100 miles of lake shore, are these 20 miles worth of the 100 miles, or are they, you know, what percentage of the lake shore are they?
Certainly somewhere, I mean, in terms of miles, it's even smaller just because they tend to be they're smaller and narrower lots than
Right.
some of the larger lots. So I would, you know, I'd say probably less than 5% of the miles of lakeshore, and then in terms of accounts, definitely less than 10%.
Right. Okay. So 5%. You know, lake access is, I think it's been pointed out, is very low, right? And we used to have a boat a long time ago before we had kids. And one of the reasons was we stopped using it when we had kids is because there was no place. And once you sit the boat in the water, you know, unless you want to fry out in the sun all day long, there's nowhere to go to use the restroom or take a break from the sun or anything. So I can see why the attraction for these lake lots, right? And maybe it's a commentary on what we need to do as a city. You know, maybe we need a marina. Maybe we need to start acquiring some of these lots, start increasing access to the lake, and maybe that would actually eliminate some of this problem. You know, maybe the city could provide some toilet facilities along the trail for trail users, and then they could also be used for some of these lot users. Because if you can only boat into the lot, you know, there's going to be, how are you going to get parking? How are you going to get a garbage truck? It's just not going to happen. So that kind of, I think, could create some undue hardships. When I look at the memo that was put out here, there was some concern about additional hardening of the lakeshore and how that's bad for fish, and how we're concerned about that happening on these rec lots. Yet these rec lots represent 5% of the lakeshore, and this hardening is a common thing done on residential development. So I'm really start questioning although I want to respect the ecology and believe that we need to worry about that, I wonder really how big of an issue that is in this context when essentially the residential use gets to kind of almost loophole a lot of these things we're talking about in the SMP, including visual access. It's not just physical access, it's visual access. And in fact, some of these lots are providing that visual access and is satisfying the SMP policies, where on a residential side, it's not. So it's kind of like we're picking and choosing which things we want to say that are important out of the SMP, and then looking at these different lot uses and saying, we're going to use these group for these lot uses and this group for this lot use. So I think we have to be careful with all that. So even though I thank you for working through this, I don't envy you for having to work through this. So I guess those are just a handful of kind of observations and things that I came up with that struck me. Thank you.
I could raise for me, just in my observation and working through a lot of these permits with the staff, the biggest thing missing from our code is that applies to residential development, but in these individual lots, it does not apply to because of a loophole, is the implementation of the vegetation enhancement area. So at the end of the day, if the only thing we got out of this was a requirement that with a private park type use being put on these lots, was that they were required, just like a single family lot was required to implement the vegetation enhancement area, I think we'd be on track. The argument that we get into with the applicants and the property owners, you wouldn't believe it, about, hey, you should take a stewardship approach to this. You should really think about setting aside some area to maintain in vegetation. Well, we don't have to. We don't want to. And it's like, well, everybody else along the lake has to do that. It's part of our code. Well, we don't, show me in the code where it's required. And they're right, it's a loophole.
Right, and I think that same type of scenario could be, when one looks at the code, and I guess we have to think about the code as a series of, the NSFP is a series of policies, but then it's actually enacted into actual code language later on that's used by staff to implement these things, and that's what we're missing. But I think Tracy and I had a conversation about a proposed residential development, and I made the comment about, well, what are we doing to balance this visual access thing? And I was told, well, we don't really have any hard code in here to enforce anything, so it remains at the policy level forever kind of realized, yet the public reads it as and expects it to be realized, but there's this underlying legislation at the state level that kind of eliminates those things from ever being realized, I guess, is kind of what I understand. When I look at the slides of these lots and I see these lots, even though that some of the vegetation has been trampled, I look at that lot, and if we were to take an equivalent shot of an oblique of where a house was built, I would see the one that's undeveloped being a lot better for the environment than the one with a house in it. Yet it seems to be the discussion is flip-flop. So it's just part of the kind of the realities of what we're having to deal with here.
And I put up on the screen an excerpt from the actual Shoreline Management Act, the enabling legislation here. And this has been really the point of contention in almost every jurisdiction I'm aware of that's gone through a major update on their Shoreline Master Program. And it's the battle between what is the priority of use along the shoreline. And this specifically says, this summarizes it in a nutshell, is that there was this one sentence that was added to the act that has caused a whole lot of chaos around how we prioritize what happens. And it says here, alterations of the natural condition of the shoreline of the state, in those limited instances when authorized, shall be given priority for single-family residences. And it goes on to list other uses, but the way this has unfolded in the courts is that because it's listed this way, that the first use that's given the most priority is the single-family residence. So regardless of all those other objectives of the act, this is the priority use on the shoreline is a single-family residence.
But these places we're talking about, these lots, can't have single-family residences.
So this was in response to Commissioner Brooks' comment about shoreline visual access, and that not being something that we have lived up to with regard to implementation when considering what some of our policy language says. And I'm trying to highlight here why that's the case, is because we have all these different objectives to balance. Unfortunately, the state legislature didn't really do us any favors when they wrote this by putting that single-family residences shall be the priority as even over the public views along the shoreline. So we have to look at it with this lens when we actually then implement it, and that's just simply due to the way it's written. If the legislature wants to change it, we would happily then prioritize something differently in line with whatever the legislature says is the number one priority, because it is actually a statewide issue. It's not just a local issue.
I just want to make a quick comment. Again, want to thank the staff for taking such an intense issue and trying to codify it. I think the lens that I'm going to look at all the changes it's really what stands out is no net loss of ecological functions. I think that is really important. We're named after Lake Sammamish, and not many of us have access to Lake Sammamish. So I think that is also something that stands out for me. Even though it was mentioned that it's just 5 to 10% of the land along our side of Lake Sammamish. Okay, 5% of along our side of the lake, I'm assuming. I think what I would be interested in knowing more about is especially the impervious surface and the requirements for parking. I think, like everybody has mentioned, it is a challenge along the lake, and for me, that just adds more impervious surface to our land, which we should probably not be doing. So that is something I'll be looking for as I go through the code again. And I think it would be really helpful for me, and I think other commissioners to understand too. I think, like you said, you are approaching this because there's a loophole in our code. We don't have anything for non-residential purposes. And hearing some of the examples that you've gone through. And also, I think for me, understanding, for example, if there is a residential house there, how many trips are people, on an average going to take their boat out? Are they taking it out every day? What's the impact on the land there is today versus, if it's used as a recreational facility? Is it just during a particular season of the year? Is it throughout the year? I think that information will be helpful for me to, go forward with this. And there was something else, but I think it skipped my mind. And I think the other with the residential, I think what I've heard you say is when there's a single-family home, there's a requirement to have a vegetation area, which in this non-residential, which you don't have right now, and that's what is the biggest loophole that you see. So I really look forward to working through this and tackling as and when we see. I think other thing which will be important is also, do other jurisdictions have similar requirements, especially for HOAs and groupings of ownership? I think I would be interested in knowing that. So thank you.
Anyone else? Great. And also, Aaron, thank you for putting up with us this evening.
Thank you.
Thanks. All right, next we'll have public comment on this topic. I have a list here of a few people. Anyone else can join at the end as well. I do want to just remind everyone that generally speaking in public comment, we don't engage in conversation back and forth either with staff or with the commission. So you'll have 7 minutes and we'll listen. And if you're still talking at 7 minutes, I'll probably interrupt you. I know some people might have trouble with 7 minutes and some people might not. So, all right, first on the list we have Bill. Bill, is it Way?
Is this working? It is. My name is Bill Way. I live at 3451 East Lake Sammamish, Shoreline Northeast. I've lived on the lake since 1956. And I've grown familiar with natural risks of windstorms and flooding, like not getting yourself between a boat and a pier and saving several lives, towing down boats back home, etc. I kind of view my home as having a marina. I have to figure out how to get fuel from my car to the boat to refuel it without spilling, et cetera, and to keep my boats intact. And I monitor my neighbors and try to train them up as new people come in, and some people get it quicker than others about management of such things. I wanted to kind of cover some areas that haven't been covered. I've got my paper pretty marked up. The entire length of the city's 8 miles of Lake Sammamish shoreline has an adjoining right-of-way owned by King County Parks as part of the East Lake Sammamish Regional Trail property. Well, we sort of mentioned that everybody's got to cross this thing to get to the lake. We haven't really talked about the implications of that ownership. Beachfront owners typically take ownership of the unimproved county right-of-way, where a 100-foot total right-of-way pertains. Improvements by adjoining property owners is typically on some 35-some feet of public lands where the county built concrete staircases that are on their own right-of-way. And then the fences go up, signs go up, gate locks go up to keep the public out of the land that's owned by the county. So kind of the beginning difference between an approved and built residence is it's got more depth between the edge of the county right-of-way and the ordinary watermark of the lake, and whatever the setback was, or buffer setback was at the time the home was approved. So in a lot of the instances with what was described as 5% or whatever, the property in question may be 0 to 8 to 10 to 15 feet deep or wide from the shore upward, and then typically 35 feet of county right-of-way up to the toe of the improved trail. So there's plenty of issues over management of shoreline across the board, but specifically with questions with improvements on beachfront. The sort of the elephant in the room is the county, where they may approve a porta potty on the now that's on their property for beach owners' use, where they allow now a car pickup to go down to and be serviced and otherwise to drive down to the lake is all on county property. The implications of that, whatever we think we have today, may be removed tomorrow with the county master plan that would go. Some of these parcels go into the lake, and the only part that's owned by even on homes out towards Sutter's Point, with a 200-foot buffer or 200-foot right-of-way, the ownership of now County Park Trail goes out into the lake, and only lake outward is the dock owned by a private party on the other side of the tracks now trail. So all these have serious implications about what we think are real context for what uses. We've got a pier that's been approved or may be approved for community pier, but perhaps tomorrow there won't be any porta potty and there won't be any vehicular access that we have today. So anyway, a lot of questions. So that's kind of led to future demarcation of where private property begins may become standard with trails and day use for public on the landward side of the regional trail. Further degradation by removal of vegetation on public property by waterfront shore owners has resulted in thousands of cubic yards of soil being swept out into the lake during high water storm events. And if we do get mitigation, well, I say we, if the public gets mitigation requirements approved in the 15 or less for approval of a pier, that's not even making up for the degradation that's occurred to the toe of the fill of the trail to date. Let me see what else I want to cover here. So kind of pushing the subject that David referenced, as far as no net loss of ecological function per SMA is not real. And at any terms. I'm a certified wetland scientist, and I'll have to say that homes, whatever's been done, given all the local, state, and federal laws that pertain to the shorelines, degradation of shorelines of Lake Sammamish occurs daily. Placement of concrete block, rock on the edge, or even within ordinary water mark, removal of vegetation along the shoreline, placement of kill-all, import of sand, heavy seeding, fertilizers, weed killers along the shoreline, removal of hard stem bulrush in the near shore. That's the nursery ground for fry and most any fish. Anyway, so I'm over. I've got 28 seconds. So anyway, this is going to lead to this accumulative impact challenge that was referenced. And either we grapple with it now or things are, it's, so, yeah, the cumulative impact assessment, this upland anchor use.
Sorry, Bill, can you wrap it up, please?
Sure, I'm done. I was asked 20-some years ago by the city regarding buffers and constructive mitigation strategies. I told them the most critical area is between the high water and the near shore area. And at this point, in Sammamish, in Redmond, in Bellevue, and Issaquah, the lake is near dead. It's a dead bathtub ring around it. So we're going to hit a big one here with extinct or whatnot. Thank you.
I move that the meeting be extended to 9 p.m. With the possibility of a recess or not. That's
Second.
It's been moved and seconded to extend the meeting to 9. All those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed, no. Okay, the meeting's extended to 9. Does anyone else need a 5-minute break? Okay. Next, Mark Cross. Welcome.
Thank you,
7 minutes now, right?
Chairman, Planning Commission, staff. I did serve on the City Council during the time when the original Shoreline Master Plan was being reviewed, and I voted in favor of it in 2011. So I'll be interested to follow your deliberations as you look at any potential changes to it. And certainly there are things that the code was looking and anticipating, and some things that it was not anticipating. I do want to suggest that the couple of reasons that you want to have a code at all is that this directs residents as to what the use of their property is considered their fair use of their property, and what might be considered burdens on other people's private property rights. And that's a part of what you're establishing here. The other part is the environmental considerations, where the lake, through state law, is considered to be a more sensitive area than just your average lot and your average subdivision. The final thing, though, is that the hearing examiner will read your language, or the language adopted by the City Council in making their decisions. And I wanted to read one on setbacks, because you have two shoreline areas in the city. One that consists of most of the shoreline is in a residential area, suburban residential shoreline area. And we had an area that was more rural, more where these lots are that you've discussed tonight, and where we have set a 50-foot setback rather than a 20-foot setback. But the hearing examiner felt that that really wasn't something, the 50-foot setback wasn't to be obeyed, and instead, in fact, in considering a variance request from the 50 down to 30, that it is thus apparent that the city's legislative officials believe that a 20-foot Lake Sammamish shoreline setback was generally adequate. So the fact that we had established certain areas where we wanted 50 feet for environmental reasons, he did not see that as being reflected in code that he had to follow. And the efficacy of the legislative policy cannot legally be challenged in the context of this quasi-judicial permit process. So Mark Cross, you're lost, because you're trying to hold somebody to a zone setback for environmental purposes, but because the city had allowed 20 feet in other parts of the shoreline, he was really only thinking 20 was what and we should be grateful that we got 30. The proposed development will maintain a shoreline setback that is 50% greater than the 20-foot minimum allowed in most of the city. So it does affect how permits are reviewed and approved, what you say, and as you become firm in the recommendations you want to give to the city council, I hope that you would work with staff on language that helps you and staff put that into draft code that the council can then consider for adoption or not. But I will tell you that in looking at the rights on the shoreline is not unlike rights in other parts of the city where you have a single-family house. I was on the city council. We were looking through the code that had been adopted from King County, and it became apparent to me in one little piece of code, and I'm proud of having found this late one night, that in fact the old King County code allowed each residential lot to have 2,000 chickens. Now you can imagine today if somebody said, well, it says 2,000 chickens, what are my neighbors complaining about? We had another situation where a person was working on a project up here controlling traffic when they saw the big buck come out of the forest. They dropped the stop sign, grabbed their rifle out of their truck and went in and shot the deer, and suddenly 911 lights up with shooting by the school. So there are times and places when private use of property is limited so that the use doesn't spill over onto other properties, whether they're a $4 million house or in many cases, as people testified at the time, properties that have been in the family for 80 years and don't necessarily have a big house, even though it's valued at a high number. You have to imagine just in any part of the city, if you were to allow these more intensive uses without bathrooms and without parking, you'd have people in here complaining to you. When King County goes and takes the properties that they own from the park and starts to do shoreline use on the properties that they have that extend out into the lake, you're going to hear the neighbors come in and say, where's the parking, where's the restrooms? This is a big impact to me. So don't just think about the private property owner and whether they can form an LLC and do a condominium and have 6, 8, 10, 20 families that think this is where they can come and party in the summertime or the wintertime. But think of the neighbors to this and think, is that really fair in a single family zoned area? Because it's all zoned for that, just single family, not duplexes, not fourplexes, not restaurants, not auto repair, and certainly not to poop in the bushes. And we can sit here until 9:30 and pretty soon somebody here is going to need a restroom. And I think people that use these properties need them as well. So for the idea for them, in some cases, like the one on the Paul residence that I'll turn in as an example, they were really looking to have all kinds of variances. So 150-foot variance from a fish stream became 37.5 feet. Is that really what you want? And by reading these, you can see how they relate the code to those decisions. I think it'll be helpful to you. But I will say that you also have a couple problems. One is that the fecal coliform, meaning the amount of human waste in Lake Sammamish, is high enough that we rank as one of the most polluted water bodies in the country. It's called the 303D list, the federal 303D list. So you do not want to be saying we're going to fool around with human waste very near this water body. Thank you very much. I understand you'll be having more meetings and we'll bring you more information. Thank you.
Thank you for comments, Mark, and also thank you for your past work on City Council. Tim is next.
Evening. My name's Tim Hauser. I live in Sammamish. I live actually in Inglewood Beach community, which was referenced earlier as.
Can you please state your name and address? Which you stated your name, just state your address, please.
Oh,
for the
address.
record.
Okay.
Thank you.
809 206th Avenue, Sammamish, 98074. Yeah, sorry. Never write it anymore. But anyway, so I live over on the Inglewood Beach Hill community. It was referenced earlier. We have one of these plots of lands that we're discussing this evening. And the way I view it, and from what I heard tonight, there's a primary concern. Oh, these are not. Somebody leave their glasses?
That's probably me.
There you go. Thank you. Yep. There's a primary concern about keeping some of the land in place to allow for salmon or fish or whatever it is, and that's one primary concern. And then there's what seems to be, from my point of view, a overreach of asking us to put in parking and garbage and restrooms and all that, which doesn't necessarily impact what the goal of what you're trying to solve here is. So I want to make sure that what we're doing actually impacts what the goal is, and not just puts in a bunch of other things that would be prohibited for us to be able to do things. We can't put in a parking structure anywhere near our beach. We can't put in a porta potty because of the hill that's been created because of the trail there that would be anywhere near accessible for one of the septic tank trucks that were referenced here. Like, it's feasibly impossible, and it puts limitations on what we can and can't do with our beach. We would be totally happy, I think, as I speak for my community in general, to block land aside if we ended up wanting to put in a dock or something. But to go ahead and do these other things would be totally prohibited and not allow us the freedom to use the beach the way we wanted to do it. So that's my point of view, and I think it was made very strongly here, and probably better than I can speak, because I haven't had a chance to review quite as much as I would have liked by some of the commission members here, what we should be trying to solve versus not. So it's only 2 minutes, but that's kind of what I got to say. I'm sorry, what?
You have more time.
Oh, I know. I just don't have, that was it. Unless you want me to stand up here and ramble for another 5 minutes.
Thanks for your comments, Tim. Can I just maybe clarify, I believe, and you correct me if this is wrong, we didn't really talk about it, but these requirements would apply to new developments, not to any that are existing. So in that example, if you wanted to change something, they would apply. But for people who already have something in place, these requirements do not apply because those are grandfathered in, essentially.
So if we wanted to put in a dock.
Then they would apply because it's new. But we didn't really talk about the fact that existing is grandfathered in. All right, is there anyone else who'd like to make public comments? Yep, 7 minutes. Please state your name and address as you start.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for all the work as well. It's good to hear that. My name is Anthony Bice. I live at 1544 to 11th Avenue Northeast. I'm also part of the IBC Inglewood Beach community. So we read the proposal today because I have a tough job. We totally understand. I think we definitely salute the effort of protecting the environment. That's first and foremost. What I wanted to do today was just through public comment, give an example of, I think, the situation at IBC and sort of how we're thinking about these restrictions. I think hopefully that helps you guys in your decision making. So the IBC in general, nobody, we don't have any, as Tim said, we can't build parking spaces. So where a lot of this actually started was we have a community that uses the beach club. It's fairly underutilized, actually. We're happy to actually build a metrics-driven process to show you guys this. It's not a wild bunch of people pooping all over the property. Just on an average night, and again, we're happy to use some AI to judge this. I think there's, on general, 4 to maybe 3 to 4 people on the property. And most of the time, it's kids jumping off the dock swimming. So where a lot of this started, actually, when this was raised our attention, is we wanted to put in, we have, like I said, a floating dock. It's aging poorly. Some of the kids are actually struggling to get up on it to jump off. So we wanted to, of course, put in a floating dock so the kids can kind of walk out, jump, swim in the water. No one in the beach club has a motorized boat. Nobody actually moors the boat there. I've been going down there for 3 years. I haven't seen a motorized boat. If anything, my wife's actually was on the beach club. She manages the boats, even the paddle boats that we store along the fence. No one really uses. So we're trying to figure out who the owners are, and this is how aged this situation is. So again, just very different than I think the chaos we're hearing. So the thing I wanted to paint that picture of you guys is we want to support the environment effort, but for example, if we came to you guys under these proposal and we asked for a floating dock, we felt like we'd sort of be overgeneralized or confused with maybe other properties where I did see some of the evidence where they have a lot of boats, maybe there's a lot of people using the property and there's fecal matter all over. So I wanted you guys to consider that. Just this is our situation. We have a very underutilized property. People are walking down, not taking helicopters, and kids are just walking down docks and they're swimming. So maybe, as an idea, maybe in your proposal, you could think about building different class profiles for these public shared spaces. I'm happy to work with the committee to figure out, there's a lot of very low power official ways to use AI to count people going in and out of properties, or you could use key fob systems. And so I just propose that we use a metric-based process as opposed to just, I think categorizing every shared beach property in the same class. So that's it. With all due respect, that's just my feedback. I appreciate everyone hearing that. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Is there anyone else? Mary?
Good evening. My name is Mary Wichter. I live at 408 208th Avenue Northeast in Sammamish. And I do want to give a plug for Inglewood. Inglewood was platted in 1889. It's a historic plat. It's different than a lot of other things. I haven't been to the Inglewood Beach Club, but I walk by and see where it is. And I would say it's a very different use than the oblique photos that were showed by the consultants. So I think that should be considered. A couple other things. The Shoreline Management Act and the Shoreline Master Plan, they do talk about to prevent the inherent harm in an uncoordinated and piecemeal development of the state's shorelines. One of the commissioners said, Sammamish is our namesake. There used to be 7 basin stewards that were hired by King County to keep the lake and preserve it. There's 1 now. I haven't actually talked with him because he's been pretty busy, and we really need to do stewardship to keep track of our lake. The lake is on fecal coliform is the category 5 in the lake, and I understand that both Beaver and Pine Lakes, even though the phosphorus is getting held down to their lake management plans, the fecal coliform is going up. I will also tell you from the number of sewer and water district meetings I've been to, we're pretty lucky because our sewer is not in the lake. It's actually up, so if it ever needs to get replaced. Also, ecology requires that people's septic tanks, their grinder pumps, have to be owned by ecology down there. They can't be owned individually because they want to do that. So those are some things I've learned. I also sat through 3 days of testimony that was given on the trail, and I heard the words avoid, minimize, mitigate, and I heard them over and over and over. They're actually in the purpose of Code 21A50 for environmentally critical areas. They're also the main stem. Like if you just search for avoid, minimize, and mitigate, you'll see those really throughout the Shoreline Management Master Plan over and over. And if you look at the word reduce, reduce is typically used not the same as minimize. It's to reduce setbacks. If you look on, if you want to look on page 52 of the 120, there's a really good segment called oops, sorry, not really good here with my computer. It's environmental protection and conservation regulations. And we're letting people build in these areas where it really is supposed to be conservation, and it talks about avoiding the impact altogether, minimizing the impacts by limiting the degree or magnitude of it, rectifying the impact by repairing it, rehabilitating, restoring, reducing the overall impact, compensating for what you've done, and monitoring it. And I think those are just really key cornerstone things that we need to think about. The other thing that I can email you is when our esteemed Jeff Thomas, who works with David Pyle in community development, when they done the roundtable on growth, there was a vacant lands map, and it shows the vacant parcels in blue. I have a copy of that map. The city does too. I can forward that. I think I just looked at it. You can see where the vacant parcels are. It was done in 2016. I know that they're not all right, and there's been development since then. The other thing I I want you to really think about is, I think all the discussion here is focused on Lake Sammamish, but Pine Lake and Beaver Lake also have some undeveloped parcels, and I don't know if they have the dock problems or other things, but whenever you're doing code, you always need to think about that. How does it apply to those? I heard our esteemed Mr. Pyle talk about clearing and grading. Right now in the permanent development regulations for critical areas, they're supposed to be changing, so you can't just clear and grade. I don't know if that could apply to the shoreline areas as well, if you're designated as a shoreline. We also have a tree ordinance, and I'm wondering if some of the things in there, if those could help the areas where people have a dock or an access parcel, but they're not putting a house. We also have the urban forestry management plan that's just coming up, and I know it's just going to be policy. It's not going to be code at this time, but we really need to teach people and let them learn about understories and native plants and how to do things correctly and how not to use pesticides. I think right now, even by a stream, without the new permanent development regulations, you can just take a whole bunch of chemicals and clear up to, well, it's 50 cubic yards, but it could be a lot of area. So I think we need to do a lot of training. I also heard in some of the basin plans, people that live down by the streams where the salmon, and we're doing a lot of restoration for those areas, they're washing their cars right in the area right next to the stream. So I think there's a lot of proactive things that you can do by educating people, letting them know what's good, letting them know what has impact. And then as we go into that phase 2 of the development regulations where you talk about the critical areas and the shorelines, I think you've got, like, Inglewood actually has the shoreline designation. It's an erosion hazard area. It's got landslide hazard areas. I think you've got a lot of those things that are supposed to protect the lake. So there's a lot of things that can be working together. And I think of all the stuff I read in the 120-page packet today, page 114, which talks about vegetation, and I think is probably the most important. I can tell you from where I live, loopholes in the code really suck, because if there's a loophole and it doesn't, people can do whatever, and you can't even tell the city or complain because they'll just go, it's not covered, and you just live there and you're left with you can't even do a civil lawsuit because there is no code or regulation for it. So I think we really have to look where there's code and regulation. And when I send you the blue vacant lands map, I want you to look at how much of it's blue and how much of it's white, because I don't know exactly how much Sammamish has developed, but just visually, and I've asked a lot of people, we have about 10 to 15% of the city left to develop. We need to develop that differently than we developed the first 50 or 60 or 75%, because there's only a few lots left. And like even the visual aspect of being able to see the lake, that's important. We just don't want to look through really tall houses or see really tall houses and just not have any access. So I'm trying to tie a bunch of things together here. There's only one error I found. It's on page 56. It talks about chapter 15.05 of the SMC being for surface water management. In 2011, that was changed to Title 13. You do have other errors on that page, so if you could just make that one tiny correction, that would be great. I think all the work and the discussions here, I think, are super important. I hope some of what I said makes sense and will be considered as well. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments, Mary.
Good evening, Planning Commissioners. Paul Stickney, 22626 Northeast Inglewood Hill Road. The comments tonight are just sort of extemporaneous based on what happened this evening. I think it was a real good meeting. Staff did a good job. You asked a lot of good questions that looked at both sides of this issue. And I just have a few things to add that I haven't heard tonight, or if they were said, I apologize if I didn't hear they were said. The shorelines is a real large issue, and I think the GMA actually, in 1990, it had 13 planning goals. But in 2010, it added a 14th, which is the shoreline. So it is a significant issue. So it's an important part of our whole city. And I heard tonight a lot of emphasis on the Sammamish identified issue as the residential sites was a large focus of the meeting tonight, and I said that wrong, of the non-single family residential sites that can be used for recreational purposes. I'm asking an overarching question. Are we charting new ground here as a city, or are we catching up? We as the Kings we. So is Issaquah and Bellevue and Mercer Island and Kirkland and Kenmore, a lot of our neighbors that have waterfront that they manage, especially Kirkland, which annexed a huge area of King County several years ago that is a more rural area, a little like some of ours were. Have they faced these issues, or have they had issues? And if so, what have those cities done? So I think just gathering information, are we, are we charting new territory here and trailblazing, or are we, behind what the other jurisdictions have done? Another thing I didn't hear, and if it was said, I hadn't heard it. Does the Department of Ecology chime in on this issue, and what are their standards? Another couple interesting questions I had while sitting in back is, Sammamish has roughly 35, maybe 35 or 40 lots on Lake Sammamish. How many lots does Issaquah have? Not many, probably, because it's just the South Cove area, but on the Bellevue side, how many lots are in play there? So I'm interested, we talk about a cumulative, however, the lake isn't able to say, here's Sammamish and here's Issaquah and here's Bellevue. I think how much is happening around the whole lake would be interesting. So anyway, that's all I got.
Thanks for your comments, Paul. And that should end our public comment period. David, do you have anything else for us, or Kelly? Great. Could somebody?
I do have a reminder for the commission that we do have a training on May 30th for using Robert's Rules of Order for running efficient public meetings. Just a reminder, if you haven't signed up, please do.
Is that Jurassic Parliament? It's pretty good. Okay. I think we're done. Would somebody like to move to adjourn?
I move we adjourn.
I second.
It's been moved and seconded that we adjourn. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Thank you, everyone. Have a nice evening.